This is a school dedicated to something rare today. The Lyme Academy in Old Lyme, Connecticut offers serious discipline training in drawing, painting, and sculpture in the figurative tradition. Its mission is to teach foundational skills while empowering a new generation of artists. And that's exactly why this workshop felt so meaningful. I was invited to teach a 5-day historical materials and techniques workshop where students would not just read about old master methods, they would physically recreate them.
So I was awarded a scholarship at the Pennsylvania Academy to travel, the Crescent Scholarship, a wonderful scholarship that allows students to travel to Europe. And when I got to Europe, I was just blown away by all the wonderful paintings at the Prado Museum, the Uffizi galleries. And that's when I began to realize I have to go back and do some reverse engineering, as you guys call it nowadays, right? And I started collecting old manuscripts. I don't know if you are familiar with this little book, Cennino Cennini, El Libro dell'Arte. It's one of the first thorough manuscripts that gives instructions on how to make a lot of these materials.
Over the course of the week, we followed a trajectory inspired by Cennino Cennini's historic painting manual El Libro dell'Arte. We set out to recreate panels, gesso, canvas, rabbit skin glue, oil preparation, pigments, and traditional grounds. The goal was simple: to help students understand painting from the ground up, not just how to paint on a surface, but how that surface is born. We began with one of the oldest questions in painting: what is the painting actually built on? Before color, before brushwork, before composition, there's support: the panel, the canvas, the ground. Students learned how historical painters selected wooden panels and prepared them carefully before painting. This step matters because every layer that follows depends on the stability and quality of the surface underneath. Then we moved into one of the most humbling parts of the workshop: traditional gesso. Today, most artists know gesso as something that comes ready-made in a jar. You open it, you brush it on, and you're done. But historical gesso is a completely different experience. Students made traditional gesso using rabbit skin glue and chalk or calcium carbonate.
Let's start with a little bit. It's easier to start with a smaller amount instead of just dumping everything on there, okay?
They learned very quickly that this material demands patience, sensitivity, and respect. The glue cannot be overheated, the mixture cannot be rushed. The surface cannot be treated casually. Every decision matters. Too thick and it becomes difficult to apply. Too thin and it may not build properly. Too careless and the surface begins to show imperfections. This was one of the first major lessons of the week. The old masters were not just painters, they were craftsmen. They understood materials deeply because they had to. Applying the gesso was even more difficult. Cennini recommends building the layers carefully, often in one sustained working session. Students discover that this is not something you casually do between other tasks. It requires rhythm, it requires focus, it requires discipline. Layer after layer, the student built up the surface as they worked, and they began to understand why this process was so highly refined over the centuries. A beautiful gesso surface does not happen by accident, it is earned. Then came another important discovery: the difference between sanding and scraping. Sanding can smooth the surface, but scraping gives a very different kind of control. Students saw that historical technique is not just about following instructions in a manuscript. It is about embodied knowledge. You have to feel it, you have to make mistakes, you have to be guided through the process. And that was one of the most powerful parts of the workshop, watching students realize that these texts come alive when you practice by hand. We also compared traditional gesso with modern acrylic gesso. Modern gesso is convenient, it is fast, it is practical, but when students placed it beside traditional gesso, they began to see and feel the difference. The traditional surface had a distinct character, it had absorbency, it had luminosity, it had a certain responsiveness that connected directly to historical painting practice. That comparison was important because this workshop was not about rejecting modern materials, it was about understanding choices. When you know the old methods, you become a more informed modern painter. From panels, we moved on to canvas. Students learn how to stretch linen properly, pulling, aligning, stapling, or tackling, adjusting tension, and preparing the surface for sizing. Then we apply rabbit skin glue to the canvas, and this was one of the most exciting moments. As the glue dried, students saw the canvas tighten beautifully. The surface became taut, responsive, and ready to receive the primer. Rabbit skin glue is an imperfect material. It is hygroscopic, which means it responds to humidity. It can expand and contract with environmental changes. But it has been used for centuries, from ancient traditions through Renaissance and academic painting, because of the surface it creates. The students could feel why painters used it. Then we compared it with PVA size and modern synthetic polymer. At first, PVA seemed easier, but when the primer was applied, students noticed something disappointing. The canvas began to loosen. Because PVA behaves differently as a synthetic material, the surface did not respond in the same way. It stretched and softened under the application. That contrast was valuable. It gave students a real-world understanding of why materials matter. Not in theory, not in a textbook, but right here in their hands. Next, we moved into oil. Students learned the value of washing linseed oil, a time-honored practice used by painters to improve the handling and behavior of their paint. Historically, artists wash oil to make it cleaner, more stable, less yellowing, and in some cases, better drying. We followed recommendations drawn from historical practice and recreated this process carefully. The students saw that even oil, something many artists take for granted, can be refined, it can be prepared, it can be understood, and this changed the way they thought about paint. Paint was no longer just something squeezed from a tube, it was something made. Then came pigment. Students created their own oil paint using traditional pigments, including lead white and ochres. This is a major turning point. When you grind pigment into oil, you begin to understand paint differently. You feel the body of the pigment, you feel how much oil it wants. You feel whether it's short, long, stiff, buttery, lean, or rich. Students learn that every pigment has a personality. Lead white behaves differently from ochre. Ochres behave differently from other earth colors, and once you experience that, your relationship to painting changes. You stop thinking of paint as a product, you begin to understand it as a material language. Of course, with historical pigments such as lead white, we work with caution, cleanliness, and respect for proper safety procedures. Using the paints and grounds we prepare, students then explore traditional priming methods on linen prepared with rabbit skin glue. We looked at approaches connected to pre-17th century practice and also methods that continue well into the 19th century. This helps students understand that painting history is not just one single recipe. It is a living chain of experiments, refinements, and regional traditions. Every surface tells a story. A panel tells one story, a linen canvas tells another. A chalk, lead, and oil ground all create different experiences for the painter. Once students understood that, they could see how the old masters achieved certain effects not only through the brushwork but through structure. The painting begins long before the image appears. Throughout the week, I was deeply proud of the Lyme Academy students. They were not just learning techniques, they were building discipline. They were learning patience, they were developing respect for process, and they were discovering that painting is not merely an image-making activity. It is a craft, it is a commitment, it is a conversation with materials, history, and time. That is what impressed me most. Their willingness to slow down, to struggle, to repeat, and to refine. To keep going when the gesso was difficult, when the canvas changed, when the surface was not perfect, when the materials demanded more from them. That is where real artistic growth happens. By the end of the workshop, the students had done something rare. They had recreated historical painting supports and materials with their own hands. They had prepared surfaces using methods that connected them to centuries of painters before them. And in doing so, they preserved something important. These techniques are not lost. They are not museum relics. They are alive whenever artists practice them. That is why places like Lyme Academy matter. The Academy offers a kind of education that is increasingly rare today, rigorous hands-on training rooted in the history, traditions, principles, and skills of fine art. In a world that moves faster and faster, this kind of education teaches students to slow down, to observe, to prepare, to commit, to understand that mastery is not instant, it is built layer by layer, just like painting. This workshop reminded me why historical materials still matter. They teach humility, they teach discipline, and they teach patience. And they show us that the old methods are not old because they are outdated. They're old because they survived, because they work, because generations of artists refined them, trusted them, and passed them forward. And now watching these students carry that tradition into the future, I felt an immense sense of pride. The craft is still alive today, the knowledge is still being passed on, and the next generation of painters is ready to build on it.